Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this session on Office 365 security. My name is Ben Menesi and I'll be your host today. So let's get started real quick by thanking our sponsors. They make these events possible, and so definitely check them out after the presentation. My name is Ben. I work with Panagenda as VP Products and Innovation during the day, but I am an offensive security consultant kind of by night, but I've been working in this for a couple of years, certified ethical hacker and working towards an OSCP, that is the Offensive Security Certified Professional designation, one of the most fun training experiences that I've ever experienced. I love breaking things and usually getting paid for them. So that's the way of an ethical hacker, is that you actually get contracts to break into places. A lot of those involve Office 365 environments. And I am a recent bar owner, so that's just another useless competence that I've got over the years. Now, I do want to talk a little bit about what we do. So Panagenda, we have offices around the world, from our headquarters in Vienna, Austria, to Boston, Germany, the Netherlands, and Australia. And what we specialize in is Office 365 management. As I've said, I work as a product manager, and so definitely not going to talk about this during the session. Just wanted to also introduce the company. Our product is called Office Expert. If you guys are interested in deep analytics and Office 365 management, definitely check this one out. And so I've got about 89 slides for 50 minutes. So this is going to be a lot of fun. What we'll cover today, of course, security is a gigantic subject. So we could talk about it for days, but I'm going to focus on a couple interesting areas. We're going to get started with ransomware, cover a little bit of email security, talk quite a bit about illicit consent grants and third-party applications in general, then move into multi-factor authentication and all the stuff that can go wrong with it, and the things that you can defend against using multi-factor authentication, and then talk about actual attacks. So throughout the presentation, you'll see that we'll take kind of a practical approach from an offensive security person standpoint. I think this is going to make things interesting. Please go ahead and ask questions if you have any. I'll make sure to get back to you on those as soon as I can. Now, I want to start with numbers. We are an analytics company, and really, I love numbers. So one of the reports that I read all the time is the Verizon Data Breach Investigations report. This is something that comes out every single year, and it's really a very good read. Some of the interesting statistics based on the incidents that they monitor, and this is over 53,000 incidents and data breaches. Some of these numbers are really shocking. So one of the common misperceptions is that, we hear about all these high profile data breaches in the news, and we kind of think that our organization isn't really in danger. But as it turns out, about 60% of victims of data breaches are actually businesses with less than 1,000 employees. Oh, wow. Was I actually muted? I'm not sure. Okay, let me just go back to the beginning. Did you guys hear me so far? Can you please give me something here? Okay, so let's start with a quick introduction. My name is Ben Menesi. I work here at Panagenda as VP Products and Innovation. I worked for over 10 years with enterprise customers, started out in the IBM world, and I work as an offensive security specialist with customers specifically around Office 365. Now, we at Panagenda, we've got offices around the world, about 10 million plus user licenses, and we specialize in Office 365 management and deep analytics. If you're interested in this, please check it out. And as far as today's session goes, we'll talk about a couple aspects of security. We're going to get started with ransomware. We're going to talk about email security. We're gonna talk quite a bit about illicit consent grants and all the nasty things we can do using third-party applications and what we need to pay attention to. And then we're going to move into multi-factor authentication and wrap things up with talking about common attacks and what we can do to actually prevent them. To get started, I'm going to get started with some numbers from the field. This is a really cool report that I tend to read every single year. It's the Verizon's Data Breach Investigations Report, where they looked at about 53,000 incidents and data breaches. Some of the numbers are really, really surprising. For example, 58% of the victims that they have monitored were businesses with less than 1,000 employees, kind of disproving the common misconception that all these high-profile data breaches are that we read about in the news are pretty much the ones that we need to pay attention to. No, in fact, smaller businesses are very common targets. The second interesting number is that 92% of the attacks that they have monitored used emails as the malware or the attack vector to get the attack into the customer's environment. So email is still, if not as important as ever today. 68%, this is a really frightening figure. 68% of these breaches took months to discover. And there is an interesting other statistic, which was around how long it takes for a customer to fix these, to patch these vulnerabilities. And that was also in the months. And so we're talking about, vulnerabilities that we know impact us or breaches that we know happen in the environment, and it still takes months to patch these vulnerabilities. Pretty insane figures. Another thing around phishing, because this is becoming more and more important every single day. I love the Avanan Global Phish report that looked at about 55.5 million emails to find some patterns, as well as there's another report here that I took as an example. 33% of the phishing emails that Avanan has monitored have passed through the Exchange Online Protection platform. 43% of the global phishing email volume actually impersonates Microsoft. That is 43% of the branded phishing emails. With that, Microsoft is the #1 impersonated brand in the world, but there is still some hope because around Christmas time, Amazon actually takes over. 90% of the emails are after malware or credential theft, and 34% of the cases after a successful intrusion, the next action was to go after the Office 365 accounts. So that is, Office 365 is really gaining a very important place in what attackers consider in their attack journey. So let's talk a little bit about on-prem versus cloud security. I talk about security quite often, and whenever I'm in a room, I usually ask for a show of hands on who's already in the cloud and who might still be on-prem. There are definitely a lot of benefits to having your data in the cloud. For example, the broader scope of threat intelligence. Because Microsoft hosts these environments, they have a much better overview of what's going on in the world, and they have much better capabilities to identify these large, high-profile attacks that might be going on. Think about WannaCry or NotPetya or anything else. It's much easier for them to actually profile these attacks and notify you than doing this all by yourself. The second thing is that you get a much larger and very specialized security muscle if you go with Office 365. Now, what I'm seeing is that SMBs, from a couple hundred employees up to maybe 500 employees, you're probably going to have a couple of IT people that are wearing all the hats in the organization. We're usually seeing that from 500 to maybe over 1,000, you might actually have a dedicated IT security person, but it's only above a couple thousand employees that you're going to get a specialized red and blue team that are offensive and defensive security specialists. So this is something that you get with Office 365 out of the box, which is awesome. And of course, because you have your data in the cloud, if you remember that statistic, you're going to get instant delivery on these things. So there's no manual patching required. Now, there are some downsides of going with a cloud service provider like this as well. One of them is that vulnerability and risk mitigation is out of your control. While the numbers in getting these vulnerabilities patched are insanely or really much better than what the reports show from on-prem environments, still it can take some time to get these fixed. And because of that, because you're using one of the most popular cloud platforms in the world, you're consequently part of a larger and very attractive attack surface as well. You also have a little bit less flexibility in customizing defenses, but we've been seeing for over the past years that this is getting a lot better. I'm going to give you a couple examples of all of these later on. Now, as far as the vulnerability mitigation, there is a practical example that happened. I think it was last year, the base striker attack. So this was an attack that essentially used a mechanism used to embed URLs in phishing emails. So usually you would just use an href tag, but you can actually use the base tag to separate the base of the URL from the rest of it. Now, the ATP Safe Links feature essentially offers that they will check where those URLs point to, and much like VirusTotal, they're going to check if those sites are safe or not. As it turns out, no, this was in 2018. As it turns out, the ATP Safe Links feature just did not work on the base sort of structure in URLs. And the interesting part of this was that it took about 14 days to get this fixed, which is pretty mind-boggling if you think about it. So let's talk about something cool. Let's talk about the ransomware. Again, when I'm in a room with actual people, which is just, it's just a nice memory right now, I usually ask for a show of hands of who's actually seen a ransomware attack in the wild. Usually you get a couple shy hands, but I think we've all kind of seen organizations or worked with customers or at least saw it in-house how this looks like. So why are ransomware attacks so important? It all comes down to the motivation of the attacker. And it's most of the cases, it's financial motivation. And it's a really quick way to make a quick buck, right? So according to the DOJ, with 1,000 attacks in 2015, the amount of attacks that they have seen and heard about in a single day has quadrupled by 2017. And there is no signs of this slowing down anytime soon. When you look at some of these campaigns that I'm sure we all heard about, WannaCry or NotPetya, they have really cost a ton of money to these organizations. There's a lot of examples. We could do an actual session on just the case studies of these ransomware attacks. So how do these ransomware spread, right? About 60% of them come from infected emails, but you still need to pay attention to your cyber hygiene is kind of the expression here. Because even though we are using Office 365 and Microsoft 365, we always still have some on-prem servers. So an example is the city of Atlanta, and this happened in 2018. As they got hit by Samsung, which was one of these ransomware campaigns, and they actually had to publicly admit defeat. Now, the interesting part of this was that, as it turns out, it all came from an SMB version 1 that was open on a web server that was on-prem. So it's still really important to regularly check for software updates, get those systems patched. Now, decrypting ransomware is, of course, a topic that comes to mind right after we encounter an issue like this. So I would do the same thing. I would start Googling. And there is a really cautionary tale here from a company. This is a public Twitter post that was done at the time. So this company got ransomware, and of course they try to find someone to help. Now, there was a data recovery company that quoted them about $60,000 to recover the data, but the POC was a little bit tricky. So they did something in a command prompt. They couldn't really see it. They ended up paying the money, and they ended up actually decrypting the ransom. There was actually a federal investigation that followed this, and it turns out that what the company did is they just got a discount and paid the ransom, and that's how they decrypted the data. This is why it's important to to just try and be safe. Having said that, there has actually been a couple campaigns where online and the security community came together and actually found the kill switch in these kinds of software. But these are always going to be open source solutions. So if you're looking for a solution to decrypt some of this stuff, you do want to check out GitHub and do a Google search on it, because chances are that the security community is working towards something. But definitely be careful with all of this. Now, talking about Microsoft and Office 365, I might have a few things where I'm going to be a little bit critical of some of the stuff that we have for our security capabilities in Office 365, but I think that the ransomware protection in OneDrive is actually extremely elegant, because what it comes down to at the end of the day is when my files get encrypted, what ends up happening is that their signature changes, right? Sometimes their extensions change as well. And so essentially, to get my files back, I mean, I can either decrypt them or just use a backup. right? And so that's what OneDrive offers is by default, you're going to get backup and restore capabilities on everything that's stored in OneDrive, which is great for you because you can go back to before the attack happened. It's great for Microsoft because you're going to end up storing much more files in OneDrive. Now, one of the other things that Microsoft says about this is that they also monitor your file assets, and they're going to get you notifications if they see a ransomware product actually encrypting your files. Now, I did some tests here, and I did not find this to be true. I use a software called Xscript. That's a free software for symmetric encryption. And so I use this for some of the cloud providers that I don't trust. And just out of curiosity, I ended up encrypting all of the files that I store in OneDrive. I did not hear a peep. So it might be that it has been fixed since then. Or maybe they just knew that this is a legit software, but this is just a little bit of caution. Now, this is an interesting presentation because, every time I present it, it changes. And sometimes I just did this presentation or a version of it 2 weeks ago, and I have to get rid of most of my content because so much is changing in security and in Office 365 as well. So email and sharing was a major part of this, but ever since that, the native email encryption became kind of the gold standard. It is part of Outlook Online, and so you can do these end-to-end encryptions, restrict emails from being forwarded, etc., which is awesome. One of the things that I really like about this feature, right, is that those of us that have been in IT for decades, right, is we always struggled with having to share these public keys and all that stuff for the PKI sort of architectures. This is not the case anymore because what ends up happening is when you send an email to someone that's encrypted, the email does not leave the environment. What you're sending out is an actual link, which in turn, and this is thanks to my friend Albert, who's an MVP for security at Microsoft for Office 365, he actually found that you can pretty easily revoke messages because even the ones that were encrypted, even if they have been sent externally, which is awesome. Right? Because what ends up happening is at the end of the day, I'm not sending the content out of the perimeter. What I'm sending is a link. And so you can grab that message using PowerShell and then basically just revoke it, which will break the link, but the individual that you send it to won't be able to access the content anymore. So this is kind of a dream come true because revoking was always just possible within the organization. This is pretty awesome stuff. And so let's really talk about the whole third-party application topic. I'm going to show you an actual exploit and a demo of how that works live. This was an exploit that was first demonstrated by Kevin Mitnick, and just saying that name out loud kind of makes me shiver because this guy is definitely my hero. He was the first person to coin the expression hacker and the first person to go to jail for it, and of course he works as a security consultant today. Essentially, what this is about is we're going to demonstrate that we can trick a user into giving us their credentials so we can access the entire organization and the assets from users to groups to SharePoint sites and all of that on behalf of that user without luring the user onto a fake site that impersonates Microsoft logins, because we know that is possible, right? But we're going to do this all within the Office 365 environment without the user ever leaving the environment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to demonstrate this not using an Apache web server, but I definitely could. I'm just going to do it using my local machine where I fired up an Express node server. And so we're going to see how this works live. So let's actually dive in. This is all going to start by the user receiving a suspicious email. And I'm gonna get things started here. So I created a small little exploit here. This is a reverse handler that's listening on my computer. The user receives an email that looks like the Azure AD Identity Protection Weekly Digest. I actually ended up copying the entire email content. It's extremely easy to make this look completely legit. What I'm seeing is that the email came from mod administrator that actually has an onmicrosoft.com address, albeit in reality, this user is part of another tenant. So when I'm the victim user, I'm going to click on one of these and say, I want to see those users that were flagged for risk. I put in my password. And I'm going to be presented with what looks like the Azure AD Identity Protection preview. Now, the unverified is kind of telling here. We could have managed that a little better if I had more time for this, but I'm just going to hit accept here and see what happens. Now, what happens here, I just hit accept, and I'm actually ending up on the right page for Microsoft Azure. And as a matter of fact, I'm logged in, so this looks all good, right? What ended up happening on the other screen is we ended up capturing the auth2 authorization code. Why this is awesome is because I can now finish that sequence. So I'm going to go ahead and start the exploit code. For the exploit code, I'm going to just copy this and input the authorization code. Do this quickly. And with that, we just received a Microsoft Graph token, all without the user ever noticing anything or leaving the organization. So let's copy that Microsoft Graph token and head over to Postman to demonstrate what we can do with this. Just so you guys see that I'm not cheating, I'm going to send this request off, and you can see that I get an invalid authentication token. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in the bearer value and the Microsoft Graph token that we just used, and I'm going to send this off to query the list of users in that organization, and voila. We just get a list of all of the users in that organization along with their email addresses, as well as some of their basic values here, basic attributes. With that, I can do more targeted email phishing campaigns. I can impersonate those other users probably as well. I could start going into I could start querying the SharePoint sites that this user has access to using a wildcard to actually list all the SharePoint sites. Now I've got the URLs that I can use to get into that organization. I can go into groups. I could actually start looking at the files of this user. I'm not sure, that's not files, that's going to be Drive. So let's just query all of the files that this user has in their OneDrives, and there it goes. I've got the links to that as well. So a ton of corporate information, all without the user ever noticing anything. So this is the attack using illicit consent grants, or actually tricking the user into consenting to an application that poses as a legit application, but ends up stealing the authorization data from those users. So what actually ended up happening, right? We received a legit looking email, clicked on it. We were presented with permissions that only needed user consent. So these were not consent permissions that administrators needed to consent to. This is the example from Kevin Mitnick. He actually ended up doing something pretty fancy, albeit pretty useless, is that he actually encrypted all the emails in the Outlook mailbox. And this is the exploit scenario a little bit further, kind of the infrastructure of what we just did. So we've got a hacker here that created a rogue application in a test Office 365 environment. After that, the rogue application is asking for a bunch of permissions, so we can craft a URL that will trick that user into consenting to these permissions. The user was presented with an email that had a URL embedded that would actually consent to this application, clicks on the link, logs onto Azure AD to authenticate, and with that, the Azure AD provides the authorization code using which we can gather the token to start using Microsoft Graph and to get access to this environment on behalf of the victim user, which is what we ended up using to gain access to the SharePoint site collections. So what could we do further? Well, you can always pivot. That's kind of the next step when you're a hacker. You have a foothold in the environment. This gave us an actual foothold. This was a really cool vulnerability that was meanwhile patched by Microsoft, but it had to do with sending malicious gifts to end users. And so you can check out the Hacker News. This was fairly recent. What ended up happening was the way that these gifts were presented, you could actually steal the authorization token using these gifts. So once you got a hold of one user, you could actually send these gifts to a lot of other employees and gather their JWT tokens as well. So this was a great way to actually pivot in the organization. Unfortunately, fortunately, this has actually been fixed ever since. So this is why I kind of call this the digital Me Too era, as in consent is key. And what we did is not very different from when you download a flashlight application to your Android phone, and then it starts asking for photos and contacts and whatnot, right? And so users are usually not trained to have an eye for this, but this is extremely important. Of course, integrated applications are really important, and they are a backbone of the ecosystem around Office 365. This is how you can use various APIs, access mails and calendars, do analytics, which is what we do. So it's a legit way to get access to users' content, content and context as well. The Azure AD does provide a secure way to authenticate these users, but again, the issue is that it's hard to train users on this kind of stuff. So who can actually register applications in your tenant? This is one of the interesting parts, is that any simple user without any administrative privileges can actually register applications in your tenant. We're going to go into prevention pretty quickly, but let's talk a little bit about the authorization flow. So if you're not familiar with OAuth 2/OpenID, essentially it's a two-step process. So you're going to ask for an authorization code where the Azure AD authenticates you, and then the Azure AD returns an authorization code, which then you will turn into a graph token or whatever token that you want to use. Now, user needs to consent to the permissions of the application, and then the application will get this token on behalf of the user. So how do we prevent this from happening? What I think is that this is still the #1 bottleneck in Office 365, and it's just the same bottleneck in Facebook. If you look at Cambridge Analytica, it was the exact same issue. This could happen in Google. This could happen for any sort of provider that uses OAuth 2, right? So what can we do to prevent all this? Application registration and consent restriction is an option. We can do regular application and permission enumeration just to see, who has consented to what and what are the third parties that have access to our environment. We could use cloud app security, and I think this is as close as it gets to an actual solution. And of course, you need to educate your users. So the first things first, restricting application registrations. Why would simple users need to be able to create their own applications in your tenant? You just go to the Azure portal, Azure Active Directory, user settings, and then you restrict them from registering their applications. Then you can go into user settings and actually restrict enterprise applications. Now, we need to say here that there are two kinds of permissions that you can assign to an Azure AD application. One is user consentable, and the second one, these are the higher permissions. So for example, to be able to access everybody's OneDrive items, you're going to need to have a global admin consent on behalf of the organization for this application to work. But there are user consentable permissions, which typically just give the application access to the environment on behalf of the user or through the user's eyes, if you like. However, because users can consent to this, this is precisely what we just abused during this scenario. So you have the ability to actually turn this off to prevent users from consenting to these lower level permissions. However, keep in mind that if you do this, if you restrict consenting on behalf of simple users, you will require global administrators to consent to everything. And so what I'm seeing, especially as we work with a lot of enterprise customers, is that the larger the company, the less global admins they will have. And so, of course, this is going to put a strain on them if they have to approve every tiny application, right? So you don't want to get these highly paid guys just doing these consents all day. So it's kind of a trade-off, but there is a possibility for this. Now, of course, you can enumerate the applications and permissions that have been granted access to your environment. You can do this using PowerShell. It's actually pretty simple. You've got the GitHub link here, and the presentation will be uploaded later on. However, this is what you get. So when you enumerate the permissions, I did this in an environment of my previous employer. We've had about, I don't know, like 15, 20 employees, and I got over 500 lines. So good luck figuring out all of this. The other issue is that every application, when you register them, has something called a redirect URL. So when you consent to an application, there is a redirect URL defining where the authorization data goes. In my example, the redirect URL was on my local host because that's what I used to capture the URL, but it could have been an Apache web server wherever I wanted to in the world, right? As long as the URL points there, that's where the authorization details go. So the redirect URLs are an extremely important part of these applications, and being sure where the data goes. Unfortunately, the enumeration script that we looked at earlier does not give you the details on these applications. So this is how you get the details on those apps. And you need to enumerate this pretty frequently just to be sure that you don't have any rogue applications that have access to the environment and hoard your data out of the tenant. You can also search your audit logs, and what you want to search for is the term consent, right? So this is when you search for events. Keep in mind that this is not going to give you the actual state of what have been consented to. This will give you the events of the consent. So it is entirely possible that what you're seeing here has been revoked since, for example. And then Cloud App Security is an awesome solution to deal with all of this, because what they're doing is you can actually create auth app security policies. What this is all about is that you can profile applications and set filters to identify applications that are asking for consent. So you can select what sort of permission level, at what permission level you want to intervene, so to speak. I usually use the community use filter, so that if it's not common, it means it's an application that is not very well seen in the environment or not very often. Or you can even do publisher criteria here. Then you can create notifications, as well as you can go for revoking the app immediately. Now, need to be careful. I mean, this is what we would have got with the scenario that we just did. We would have generated an error. However, it's kind of the same issue as with antivirus solutions, right? Is that they work based on a virus definition table or database. And so if you have an application that you just built and you try to run that, AV solutions will probably identify that as a potential risk. So there's always a bit of a trade-off, but Cloud App Security is as good as it gets to identify these issues. Cool. So let's talk about attacks and start with brute force attacks. This is really the bread and butter of every single person that works as a hacker or in offensive security. One of the sad things from a hacking perspective and a good thing from a customer perspective is that brute force attacks don't really work in Office 365 because you get shut down after 10 unsuccessful attempts. However, this does tend to provide a kind of a false sense of security, and this was something that these guys have actually identified back in 2017. We thought that brute force attacks were not an issue, but as it turns out, you can do them in a way that you fly under the radar. And so what they looked at, and Tripwire reported this, was there was a very well coordinated set of attacks with over 100,000 failed login attempts from 67 different IPs. So very well distributed networks over 7 months. It's kind of it's a way to attack these environments. It's called slow and low, to avoid any kind of intrusion detection and also any sort of lockouts. And there were a lot of unsuccessful and some successful login attempts that were using different name variations. This is actually, yeah. So this is one of the ways. We're going to talk about another example a little bit later. Was just debating myself if I should go there now. Now, how hard is it to actually acquire the right login names? I use the Kali distribution. If you haven't heard about it, definitely Google it. It's awesome. Kali Linux is actually a distribution that has hundreds of attack tools, from forensics to offensive security to password cracking and whatever. And this is what a lot of people are going to end up using. And there is a ton of tools that are ready-made, so you don't have to build them yourself. The Harvester is one of these tools. You just supply the domain name that you're interested in and some variables, and it's going to basically scour the internet for email addresses, subdomains, and pretty much anything you want to know about the target. Usually, the more you know about the target, the more bullets you have in your weapon that could be a brute force attack tool, for example. So how do we defend against brute force attacks? The reason that brute force attacks generally don't work in Office 365 is the account lockout. And this was one of the reasons that I talked about Office 365 as kind of a platform where you have a little bit less ways to customize your defenses. Before April 2019, after every 10 unsuccessful attempts, you had a CAPTCHA, and after another 10, you were locked out for 10 minutes. Now, why is this important? You can still keep trying your password all day if you wanted to, but as most of these tools will perform multiple hundreds of thousands of tries of passwords against any sort of provider in every single second, this will basically render them useless. So there was no customization, but as of April last year, we finally have the password protection policy capabilities, so you can create a custom smart lockout. So depending on your end user population, you can increase or decrease this limit, which is, I find it really, really cool. There's a newish attack / vulnerability, which is called credential stuffing. Essentially what this is about is, this is also a place where I usually ask for a show of hands. We always reuse passwords, right? So if I build a bogus website where I tell you you can win an Xbox or something, just sign up to the website with a login and with an email and password, chances are if I try that email password combination against any of the other services that you use, I will probably succeed. So what this is about is basically attackers will work with credentials that were made public during previous data breaches. So we always hear about these, right? Like PlayStation, Sony Music, blah, 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 a lot of other major providers. And so these credentials are usually available on the darknet. Basically what they do is they will look for individuals in your organization, and if they find anybody that signed up to these services using their corporate email, they will use those passwords or try pass the hash, etc. The problem with this is that, of course, they only need one single attempt to go against the environment to see if that will break into their account. Now, according to Cloudflare, the success rate of these attacks is around 0.1%, so that sounds pretty weak. But if I have 1 million logins, that means 1,000 successful logins, which is pretty much a major issue. So how do we prevent these credential stuffing attacks? The first of all, multi-factor authentication, right? Even if the attacker gets my password and login name right, with multi-factor authentication, they won't be able to get around it. Second thing, and this is pushed by Cloudflare, is that you need a bot management system. Essentially, it's kind of an IP reputation database to prevent like suspicious bots and domains, but it's really easy to get around this. So my suggestion would be number 3, which is to do your own due diligence on the data from these data breaches. Luckily, there is actually a website, haveibeenpound.com, that's run by Troy Hunt, who just so happens to be a Microsoft regional director as well. And so he built this as a project just to play around with larger data sets, and it was looking for data sets that are large enough so he can learn a little bit more about this stuff. And he ended up creating a service that is just amazing, and it's kind of the go-to place right now if you want to check out if one of your email addresses has been hacked or any of your accounts have been part of any data breach. So one of the things you can do is you can actually sign up to this service, which I have, at $3.5 a month, and use the REST API to actually check for whether there is any email addresses in any of their databases using any sort of corporate address. So here I can just check for my company, and then with the GET request, what we're going to get is the list of those email addresses that we've had, so we can address the users and have them change their passwords accordingly. So this is really, really cool stuff. So again, brute force attacks, MFA, right? We kind of liked to think about MFA. I mean, probably up to the end of last year or the end of 2018 as the silver bullet. But we know that in security, there's really no silver bullet. So there's an interesting story here. I've seen this off of Twitter, which is pretty awesome. If you guys can't read it, because usually it's a little bit tricky to read this. The individual in question just got an email, got a text message. Hey, I know you don't know me, but I used to have this phone number, years ago. I'm trying to get into an old account that's still tied to this number. It's telling me, I need a text. Like, could you please help me with that? And so it says, yes. Thank you so much. Off goes the number, and that's the end of multi-factor authentication, right? So what I would say, therefore, is it's a good idea to manage these multi-factor authentication prompts using the application. So receive the notifications for verification, because there are a lot of text and SMS spoofing services and whatnot. So this is a better way. And as far as we know, there's really no way around the authenticator and all of these push messages. So MFA, of course, there's an elephant in the room, which is the availability. There have been a number of very serious outages throughout the past couple of years, actually, and I've had customers that that actually got all of their global admins locked out of the environment for hours and hours. So what gives, right? So basically, what I would suggest here is to create an MFA, a non-MFA enabled admin account with a super complicated password just for emergencies. We call this kind of a break glass account. You do this with an exclusion from baseline MFA policy. And so this is really just something to use in case of emergencies. Another thing, and this is why I said that MFA is not a silver bullet, was a recent breach that was discovered by Proofpoint. And basically what ended up happening, of course, MFA is all about getting a second opinion on your login, right? So if I log into a cloud service or from a new computer or whatever, I get a prompt just to verify that that's actually me. But if you really think about it, authentication, specifically in Office 365, happens in a lot of different places. Every time your Outlook client or your mobile phone goes to your server and asks for a refresh or tries to sync with your mailbox, every single time there is an authentication that needs to happen there. So what ended up happening was hackers found a way around MFA and started targeting these older protocols like POP3 and some of these other insecure applications, which they could essentially brute force, because MFA was an exception for these protocols. So Microsoft had, I mean, the highlights from Proofpoint was that they observed 100,000 unauthorized login attempts from 2018 December. 72% of the tenants that they've looked at were targeted at least once, and 40% of the tenants that they've monitored had at least one compromised account because of this. So Microsoft had a response, which was to block the clients that don't support modern authentication. They introduced application passwords, which I'm sure you've seen, and they still say it's a good idea to require MFA everywhere. I completely agree. Now, talking about some of the things you can do to actually simulate these attacks against your environment. The attack simulator is one of my favorite tools in Office 365. It's available as part of the threat intelligence. It's Enterprise E5. You need to be a global admin, and your account needs to be MFA enabled. But after that, what they essentially said is we're going to give you the tools to perform the most well-known attacks and simulate them against your own users, so you can basically get them educated. So you can do spear phishing campaigns, you can do password brute force attacks, and password spray attacks as well. Where you find it, protection.office.com, and after that, threat management and attack simulator. Spear phishing campaigns, first of all, why is this important? This was very, very recently, I mean, a couple of weeks ago in the news, that all these spear phishing emails are getting extremely authentic, and especially with Office 365, sending so many messages to users, it's becoming really easy to mimic these. So basically what they did is they ended up sending out very legit looking emails targeting end users that were mimicking, offline chat messages from Teams, and it was all Teams related messages. After that, there was a landing page that looked sort of identical. I mean, if you look at it, the URL is kind of a telltale sign. And there was an immediate redirect, and then they landed the payload. So login impersonation, stealing the credentials or actually getting them to download something right away. So these were like specific COVID-19 phishing campaigns, and they're getting more and more realistic, which is why it's a good idea to use the attack simulator to actually simulate spear phishing campaigns against your end users. Microsoft actually, the way this works is they give you a bunch of example domains that they have registered, so you don't have to do it all yourself. And then you will be able to get the telemetry on these users. So you're going to be able to see who did I target with this spear phishing campaign, which of them clicked the link, which of them actually gave away their password, and you can then define a redirect URL so that you can redirect them to a page that explains what could have happened if this was a legit attack, right? So this is cool. One of the issues that I've seen, I mean, when this feature came out, I get really excited about it. But 2 days later, the site that Microsoft registered actually got flagged by Google Chrome. So this is never going to really work as intended. It's a good idea to really register your own sites and not use the standard sites provided by the tool. And as far as the content, I mean, spear phishing has really evolved over the years. And instead of just sending out bogus HR messages and trying to get users to click on this stuff, because of the, I mean, you remember we talked about the number of branded impersonating phishing emails, right? I would just focus on looking at the most amount of notifications, Teams related notifications, things that your users get on a daily basis because of using the Office 365 tools, and just try and copy those. And that's how I would train the users, instead of trying to come up with some clever way of impersonating HR or something like that, because these are really the biggest issues today. After that, you can do brute force attacks against a set of people as well. Wow, we're running out of time. Password spray attacks, where you just do a couple of targets and then uses I mean, here you would use a larger audience and then just use a few passwords against them, which is also great. Threat tracker, where you get the telemetry of these ongoing larger attacks. And then you've got secure score, which is similar to the attack simulator, in that attack simulator is kind of like a penetration test without hiring hackers. Secure score is a lot like a security audit without hiring an auditor. It gives you some basic information around, best practices. There's about 77 data points around different products. There are a couple of things that are missing from here, so I would take it with a grain of salt, but it's definitely a good idea to use this. And to wrap things up, there is just another thing that I've done. You know how we can create new passwords for end users and have Office 365 suggest the passwords. All these passwords kind of look similar, right? So I have a bit of a cryptography background and ended up analyzing these passwords. It's always 8 characters, with the first and third being always consonants. The second one's always a vowel, and then you've got 5 numbers, which gives you a total of 220,500,000 possibilities for unique passwords that are generated by Office 365. As it turns out, Kali Linux actually allows you to generate every single possible Office 365 password within just an hour, and it's going to be around, it's going to be a little bit less than 2 gigabytes in size. And then you have all of the possible Office 365 passwords. So this is why I would just let users pick their own passwords, as opposed to having them keep the ones generated by Office 365. I had to kind of fly through the end here, but the conclusion is you want to actually simulate these attacks against your own environment. Use your own phishing tactics. The phishing is becoming extremely important, so users need to be very aware of the implications of these. And I would do these phishing campaigns on an ongoing basis. And of course, you need to educate users, not just on the strong passwords, but also on the basic principles of what applications mean, what these permissions mean, etc., etc. So there is going to be a raffle. Check out the vendors here, and if you guys have any questions, then please let me know. Follow me on Twitter, get in touch on LinkedIn. I'm not sure that I've seen any questions here, or not yet anyway, but I'm going to try and get those answered. It was a pleasure having you here. I hope that you enjoyed the session, and definitely, if you liked it, please leave a comment publicly. If you didn't like it, don't do it publicly, but let me know. Thanks for taking the time out, and have a great rest.